Hello and welcome to part 2 of my look at the Minnesota Clean Cars proposal. A couple things right away. This is going to be long, so I'm going to try to get to the points really quickly. So for the too long didn't read people, you should have the gist of what I'm going to say shortly. For those of you who want to do a deeper dive, I'm going to go through my 11 pages of notes, try to do it quickly, but I read over 200 pages of charts, documents, reasonableness reports, their sonar report, and really got into the depths of their methodology and reasoning behind the different findings and why they feel that this rule is appropriate. And I tend to agree. I'll get into that in a second. I want to address the other thing is I've got a super weird bruise right in the middle of my forehead, and I don't know where it came from, but it's there, and I'm sorry, it's going to be a little distracting. But I wanted to record this today because tomorrow the Minnesota Clean Cars rule goes before the administrative rule judge on Monday the 22nd and Tuesday the 23rd of February. So I wanted to get this out there and share my thoughts after actually reading through the document, because it's easy to say it's something I would support as an EV owner, but supporting something because you think you know what's in it and supporting something because you know what's in it are two different, very, very different things. And also not supporting or being against something because you think you know what's in it and, is the same thing. So I was trying to put on my good citizen hat and read through it, even though it was incredibly boring. I can't express to you how boring it was. But let's get into my overall conclusions. My first big question was, does the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency even have the authority to make a rule like this? Some people argue that it's tantamount to making a law, and they wouldn't have the power to make a law. But what their power is, what their purview is, as granted by the legislature, is controlling greenhouse gas emissions. Within that, the main way greenhouse gas emissions are controlled are by fuel efficiency targets. Without getting too into the weeds, do they have the authority to make this kind of rule? Yes, they do. That was granted by the legislature, and although the legislature could vote to take that rule power away, they have not. And I know that was one tactic. Opponents of this were going to see if they could take the authority of the Pollution Control Agency, take that authority away from them. Here's why it might be a good idea to leave that kind of rulemaking power with them. And that is because it gives legislators cover. Instead of having to vote on this, and maybe they agree with it, but don't think their voters will because of what it sounds like, they don't have to vote on this. This is, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency doing a method of controlling pollution. And so it gives, if all the blame falls on the governor, which it probably will since he's been kind of championing this, the legislators who may have taken a political hit for supporting this but do support it kind of get some cover, and that probably goes with other agencies as well. The second main broad point is, have they thought about all the angles? Have they thought about the increased pollution from more electricity generation, and what are the emissions from that? Trust me, they looked at it from every angle, cradle to grave efficiency of gas generation from extraction, refining, and the mix of the power grid from the coal-powered plants to wind turbines to solar, natural gas, all of that. And they did it in a couple different scenarios, in a couple different ways of accounting for it, and ways of accounting how that would change over time. So it's easy to say, what about this? What about that? What about this? What about that? But trust me, they really went deep on that stuff. And they also were very conservative. I was really shocked that in almost every single case, they took the most conservative level of benefits that this rule would provide. So in a lot of cases, this is a worst case scenario. Will this have any benefit? And yes, even in those worst case scenarios, it will have benefits. And even after that worst case scenario, then they looked at, well, what if the economy tanks because of COVID and we don't get out of this kind of economic slump we're kind of in right now? And they looked at that and said, what if it's even worse? And then, yes, the benefits would be smaller. If gas prices remain super, super low for the entire length of the rulemaking process, yes, there would still be a benefit, but those benefits would be less. So that's kind of the broad strokes. It's really easy to assume what this means, but it's tougher to get into the nitty-gritty and really look at it. They also took a lot of public content and public input. This rulemaking process started in 2019. And originally, pre-COVID, they were having meetings around the state where you could go and voice your concerns, listen to speakers, listen to what, from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, what the rule was about. And in their report, they include a lot of that feedback and say why this affects this, why this affects this, what are the overall effects of this concern and that concern. And so I was really surprised that this was all in the report of, how they're accounting for things and, taking some things into consideration and maybe improving their plan. And so they did make adjustments, it seems, from that public input period. All in all, I found this to be an incredibly well thought out, very conservative, pretty much cost neutral to the state proposal. I don't see a real downside to it. An argument might be made that these standards are so easy to hit that why do we need them at all? And that's one of the most valid arguments I could see being made about it. But in my reading of the topic and what's going on in other states and what they compared in other states, is basically this puts Minnesota's hand up and says, we want a greater vehicle choice here. In the next several years, we've seen lots of announcements of automakers going full EV. And, by 2030, by 2035, that means those vehicles are going to be the ones being shipped here. What the Clean Car Rules does is it says, we want those here first. And we want access to the best technology, the best new vehicles that you're producing. And when we aren't adopting these rules, auto manufacturers ship them to other places. Now, because Europe is ahead of us in making these rules, China is ahead of us in making these kind of rules, the manufacturers right now are sending them there. And a lot of them aren't coming to the U.S. And what vehicles are being either produced for the U.S. market or being shipped here are going to the states that have these rules adopted. What this does, even if it doesn't make EV adoption faster overall, it says Minnesota gets to be part of that evolution in technology even sooner than they would normally. So for that reason, I think it's important regardless. Another question that comes up a lot is, why are we adopting California rules? Why can't Minnesota make their own rules? And I think everybody, including the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, would like to have a very tailored Minnesota approach. Now, other states have adopted this, cold weather states, Colorado. I think there are a couple states in the Northeast that have also adopted this. The reason everybody's using California's rules is because when those rules were enacted, basically any other state can adopt those rules, but they can't adopt different rules. So we have the federal rules and we have the California standard. And as much as other states would like to, from a legal standpoint, from a federal standpoint, they aren't allowed to adopt any other rules. And really that's to make sure manufacturers don't have to have a 50-state approach to regulations and federal regulations. You're either on the federal plane or you're on the California plane. So it makes it a little easier for manufacturers. And since they're already doing all the accounting and everything for the California standards, when it comes to adding another state, it's really not a big deal to manufacturers to do the additional work to add one more state. And I believe that was even stated by auto manufacturers in their data. And that was the feedback they received from them. If you just wanted high level, that's it. That's my reasoning, my thinking. And if you want to stick around for the nitty gritty, and I'll try to keep it high level again, but we're going to get further into the weeds. And I'm going to have my notes with me to make sure I'm referencing the right things, because I just finished reading this stuff and it's all a rat's nest in my mind. So here we go. So the first big document is the Statement of Need and Reasonableness. And this is basically telling what the rule is and why they need it. And that was, they call it the sonar. And that's basically, here's what this rule proposes. And that's where they talk about the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's authority to make rules like this. And it's based on the Chapter 116.07 of Minnesota statutes. Then they talk about, some of the reference data they are referring to, pathways to decarbonizing transportation in Minnesota report. And really, as this sonar document kicks off, they're talking about insulating from federal changes. Up until recently, the low emission standards for vehicles were the same across the country. This federal standard was the same as California standard. Then a year or so ago, they adopted, the federal government adopted a lower, what they call safe regulations that had lower requirement targets. So basically, vehicles didn't need to bring their emissions down as severely as they had prior. So Minnesota already has been on the low emission vehicle standards. And before I get too far into it, there's two different standards. There's the low emission vehicle standards, and then there's the zero emission vehicle standards, so LEV and ZEV. And low emission vehicle standards are your, we want vehicles to get 25 miles to the gallon, 30 miles to the gallon, 35, 40, and that bumps up over time. And then the zero emission vehicle standards are, would be battery electric vehicles that are have no tailpipe emissions. And so the mix of the two of those is the overall rule. But up until last year, everybody was doing the low emission vehicle standards. Now the federal rule was undercut to make it more lax. And so vehicle manufacturers were already on the target for the low emission standards, but now the federal government has given them an out. It's unclear whether any or all of them would take that, or if they're just going to continue, because they're still going to have to sell these vehicles in other markets as well. But what it does by adopting these standards, it insulates Minnesota from the federal changes. So we would stay on that low emission vehicle trajectory that we've already been on. Instead of adopting the federal standards or dropping down to the federal standards, we'd stay on that path. So again, it's kind of like worst case scenario. If it does nothing else, it insulates us and gives a floor of where we want to be, where we expect to be as Minnesotans. And so specifically in Section 177 of the Clean Air Act, it grants other states the ability to adopt California standards as long as they're identical to California's. Again, that's why we can't adopt our own. And that's to, like I said, avoid too many tiers in the system for manufacturers. Next, they go into describing that this is only for light-duty vehicles, passenger cars, trucks, some of the smaller trucks, none of the big industrial equipment, none of the emergency vehicles or military vehicles would be required to follow these standards. So under the LEV standards, basically you're calculating the percentage of vehicles that meet these requirements. And in your fleet, you have to have a percentage of vehicles. You have to have an overall fleet emissions level that you have to meet. So for every, little tiny car that gets great gas mileage, you can have a gas guzzling SUV, and their balance just has to be at the level of low emission standards. But for the zero emission standards, a portion of their credits that would go into the system, have to be delivery for sale of battery electric vehicles. There's a little talk of hydrogen-powered vehicles here, but since we don't have any infrastructure and no sales of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles in Minnesota, essentially they're left out of this assessment and report when we get into the data. Intermediate volume manufacturers can mix battery electric vehicles or transitional zero emission vehicles, and there again, that's getting into if they would provide hydrogen fuel cell vehicles here, which doesn't seem like is in the cards. But small volume manufacturers have no requirement. So if you make just a handful of vehicles every year, custom or small level vehicles, you aren't bound by the requirements in this rule. Manufacturers can bank credits to meet requirements in future years or can buy and sell from other manufacturers. With the California standards, basically every manufacturer has to have a bank of credits, and you want to hit that level of credits every year with the right mix of low emission vehicles and zero emission vehicles. But because California's standard is decades old and the manufacturers were all kind of part of that process as it ramped up, new states joining it have different mechanisms they can use to implement their credit bank. And so while the rule wouldn't really take effect until model year 2025, they are giving a way to bank credits, several ways actually, to bank credits. So if you're already selling, let's say GM is already selling the Chevy Bolt here. And so for every one of those that's sold, they get a credit that's more than 1-to-1 for that model year 2025. So it's an incentive the state is giving to start this process early. And by doing that, it gives them a little run time. If they don't exactly hit the 2025 target, they've got some in the bank that will help them smooth that curve out. And manufacturers are actually asking if they can bank a little more, because it gives them a little bit of risk mitigation to be able to have some extra in the bank, knowing they can smooth out if they have a down year or an economic downturn. They have a little way to smooth that out for their business planning. We'll get more into that a little bit later when we get into the data. And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking it's kind of like the NASA analogy. Recently, NASA changed how they do things in that they still do the main research, they set targets. NASA used to contract to build everything, essentially. And in recent years, with the Commercial Crew Program and with some of their other projects, basically they say, we want to hit this target. Who can do it? And who can do it the cheapest, safest, all of that. So NASA has kind of changed from the hardware producer to the guidance, and then the individual companies, the SpaceX, Blue Origin, JPL, different companies are hitting those targets, and then NASA picks whatever they think is the most appropriate ride for their mission. And that's kind of how I see this rulemaking, is it saying, we don't quite care how you do it, but we want you to get here. And they're giving tools like the different ways you can, bank credits in advance, accrue credits, in the future, and even buy credits. If you say we're not making any EVs, we're not doing any low emission vehicles, you can just buy your credits from another manufacturer. I don't know why you'd want to give that opportunity to your competition, but maybe someone would. So there's a pretty broad way that they can reach these targets. And I think by Minnesota setting that goal and saying, we want them here, these are the targets you have to hit, it gives them the flexibility to make those happen at their pace and the way they want to, in the mix they want to. So I think the credit bank system is a good way to do that and basically help them out. Additionally, in the sonar, they took lessons from other states. They had hearings with other agencies in other states that have adopted these rules or are about to adopt these rules. And one of the big takeaways from that section for me was that manufacturers have been able to over-comply, so they're banking credits, and will probably, assuming the trends continue, never hit those minimums. So it seems to be in other states, other cold weather states as well, easy for them to hit these targets. So again, if they're going to meet these targets anyway, why do we need this rule? The rule is a backstop to make sure we hit at least that. So I spoke a little earlier about how in my mind these are pretty easy to hit targets, and I think they were very conservative in the level of EV adoption, especially the more that get on the road, the more that snowball rolls. But they were saying over 10 years in their estimation that these rules would make EV adoption 6.2 to 7.4% over 10 years, that we would reach those levels. And the current trajectory that they have is 2.9 to 5.8. I think these are both incredibly low. If you think of where we will be in 2031, that EV sales would only be 7.4%, when globally in 2020 EV sales were 3%. I know Minnesota and the U.S. are lagging behind that, but that seems incredibly conservative to me. So those were my takeaways from the sonar document. I think there was 90-some pages of information, and some of it kind of rehashed. They talked about why this was a good idea, why it was reasonable, Again, the document is supposed to talk about the statement of need. Why do we need it? And is it reasonable? So they went into they referenced a lot of data they had gathered. And then there was an appendix document that was 110 pages that was where they got all the data and the charts and graphs and things in more detail. So next I looked at that document. And my big takeaway after just the first handful of pages is, as I said before, how thorough this analysis is. In one of the information sessions, there was somebody testifying against, opposing this rule, and they were using some of the data from these charts and things and saying, your own documentation shows that it's going to have a very small effect. That's true. According to some of these charts and things, the effects will be very small. One of the statements early on in this appendix document is pretty interesting and kind of sets up the through line for this whole section. And that is, well, we think considering a range of business as usual scenarios is informative for the analysis of emissions benefits and cost benefits to Minnesota consumers. We use the most conservative estimate of EV sales future as the reference scenario. So basically they're saying it could be a lot better than this, but this is kind of the floor. So when people argument, well, these are really showing, poor improvements over time or, minimal over the federal standard. A lot of these are worst case scenario situations. So it's very good to keep that in mind that, and some of the bigger impacts just show how with an even greater adoption of low emission and zero emission vehicles, it could have a pretty great impact. And talk about how conservative they're being in their estimates. At one point they say quadratic or basically exponential growth of BEVs, battery electric vehicles, is a better representation of the recent past growth in Minnesota rather than a linear progression. And they are using a linear growth pattern as their example. And so estimating the emissions benefits of exact compliance provides a reasonable but conservative estimate of the benefits that will happen in the state. Using their linear growth pattern, they're planning for a whole fleet turnover to low emission and battery electric vehicles to happen in 2052. That's basically a 25 or 30 year implementation of switching from gas to electric in just light duty vehicles. I can't fathom in 30 years there will still be, with the advances of technology and the prices of batteries coming down, as we'll talk about a little later, I can't fathom why anybody would be buying a gas vehicle in 2052. That just boggles my mind that they're projecting out that long. Again, being super conservative in my mind. On pages 31 and 32, they talk about the differences from tailpipe emissions, but also the electricity generation, the oil refining, and kind of comparing all of those factors into a vehicle. And they say even in a worst case scenario for electricity generation, the rule would still have an emissions benefit plus the PM 2.5 reductions that would come from fewer tailpipe emissions. And PM 2.5 particles are particles that are basically so small they can, when you breathe them in, they can be absorbed and go into your bloodstream and cause problems, which is why we regulate that they are at a certain level. So we want to keep those as low as possible. A lot of these charts, they go by a couple different discount rates. And what that means is $100 today will be worth less in 2 years, will be worth less in 10 years. And so with each of these financial charts, they did both a 3% and a 7% basically depreciation or discount rate to all of their figures. So basically changing over time what cumulative savings or costs would be. And on page 42, on tables 17 and 18, they show that even with that higher discount rate, there are cumulative savings to the purchaser of lower emitting vehicles. And so if you bought a model year 2025 compliant vehicle, over time, you're going to see a greater savings than a safe standard vehicle would. Going down a little bit further, they talk about fuel savings calculations assume a vehicle life of 150,000 miles. We're at 120,000 miles on our Tesla with no real discernible change in performance or ability. And our Prius is over 12 years old and has at least 215,000 miles on it. So these hybrids and battery electric vehicles are going to last longer, barring an accident or something like that, are going to last longer than 150,000 miles. I know they had to plug a number in there and a reasonable number, but I think it's just a little interesting. A concern about electric vehicles is you have to replace the battery all the time. Well, that's just not the case in modern electric vehicles. And also in our Prius, about a year or two ago, we had a $2,500 repair on it. And the repair, basically to refurbish the whole part, was all on the gas side of it. I think $20 of it were parts that even exist on our Tesla. So a big difference in maintenance costs, and they go into some of that stuff too. And so a little tangent here, but if you just consider oil changes, if a vehicle lasts 150,000 miles, you have an oil change every 5,000 miles. Cheap oil change will be about $20. And so, that adds $600 to the price over time of the car. And then you're also disposing of that oil and things like that. But it's basically a bigger delta over time as, you're saving with the low emission vehicle and you're, losing more with the higher emission vehicle. And so then they kind of start this data section off saying, well, what if we just hit the low emission vehicle standards? And then when they analyze, and so they compare the low emission vehicle standards to the safe vehicle current federal standards. And so that's what a lot of that prior information was. But then when analyzing the zero emission vehicle standard, they assume the low emission adoption as the base level because they're assuming you wouldn't adopt the zero emission vehicle standard without the low emission vehicle standard. But this again makes it a fair but very conservative analysis. They're assuming you wouldn't have one without the other. And this analysis didn't consider any state or federal incentives that may be at play. Again, conservative estimates. Well, right now, there is a federal incentive for some vehicles, not all, and there is no Minnesota state incentive. In fact, added on to battery electric vehicles, there's a $70 or $75 surcharge when we register the vehicle every year. So that helps make up for loss in tax revenue from not purchasing gasoline. And they talk through all that and why that's battery electric vehicle drivers are paying their fair share considering that $75 registration addition already. On page 53, I thought this was a really good chart, and it shows part of the reason I think their estimates of when the overall fleet is going to shift is because they're estimating that by 2028, battery electric vehicles will be at price parity with internal combustion engines. And that chart might be on page 54. But if you can save money by buying a battery electric vehicle with basically the same stats by 2028, I can't fathom, and internal combustion engine prices will continue to go up at that point as battery electric vehicles prices are dropping. I can't fathom why it would take till 2052 to turn the fleet over. That seems ridiculous to me. But it might be an argument for, in 2028, looking at raising that $75 premium on registrations to account for more of the gas tax that will be lost. I know right now there's a proposal in the legislature to raise that $75 to, I think, $215 a year for battery electric drivers. From what I've seen, that is excessive, and everybody I've talked to who drives an electric vehicle is happy to pay their fair share of taxes and do their part for road maintenance and all that. But there's a limit to when it's fair and when it's gouging. And they went through this in North Dakota too, and so I want to talk to a couple of my friends from there about how they did their analysis and settled on their number. But in the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency data, they're showing that that $75 is pretty fair at this point. On page 55, I believe they're talking about the price to consumers and the difference between gasoline and electricity costs. And they're assuming an 11 cent per kilowatt hour price for electricity. Well, we get charged overnight for overnight charging about 6 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's for nights and weekends and stuff. And we're on a time of use plan through our electricity provider. And so again, they're just being super conservative, and I think that's good. Again, we want a base level. What will be the minimum benefit to Minnesotans? On page 60, there's a net maintenance savings chart with a discount rate for EVs, showing that it's a nearly $4,000 savings over the life of the vehicle of an EV, not having those extra oil changes and water pumps and different things that go wrong on internal combustion engines. Again, I talked a little bit about that with our Prius experience of the gigantic repair bill that was parts that just didn't exist on our electric. And page 68 and 69 break it down by per vehicle savings. On page 70, they reference their calculations that basically the rule is estimated to be revenue neutral for the state. So the difference in taxes collected versus taxes lost, it ends up being essentially a wash compared to the state budget. And we'll get into that in a second here. On page 71, they're talking a little bit about that $75 registration fee. And they say for EVs, it's relative to the linear sales growth reference scenario. The current $75 registration fee would result in an estimated $18.5 million increase in state revenue over the first 10 years of implementation in the clean car scenario. And for the low emission vehicles, $112 million increase in sales tax would offset most of the $192 million lost fuel tax. So in this scenario, it's kind of showing that BEVs, battery electric vehicles, would be better for the state than a hybrid. I may have misunderstood that, but that's how it appears to me, because low emission vehicles won't be paying that extra $75 every year on registration, but battery electric vehicles will. Again, on 72, they talk about it's probably revenue neutral for the state because the net state revenues would be roughly $92 million over 10 years, so an incremental fraction of state revenue. And then they seem to suggest maybe a $14.63 added registration cost to low emission vehicles to offset that tax loss from the vehicle as well. But they think that will happen because of the slightly higher vehicle cost. So if you're going to buy a ICE version of one vehicle, a low emission version of like a plug-in hybrid version, and a battery electric version, right now the ICE would be lower priced, so that tax revenue would be lower. Battery electric would be, I think, next in their estimation, so slightly higher, plus you're adding that $75 registration fee, and then plug-in hybrid would be the most expensive, in which case they would have a higher registration, tax burden. So that's what they're figuring through that. Next, they get into the health benefit analysis. That's on page 73. And it's kind of interesting that they still use a 3% and 77% discount scenario for health benefits over time. And I understand that they're translating that into dollar amounts, but I would think the health benefits would compound over time, because if a person is healthier today, that means they're gonna be healthier tomorrow. And if that benefit keeps improving, you would think their overall health generally will be improving too. But I think this is just another example of them being conservative. On page 74, they're talking about how the data they have available is limited in scope of the types of air pollution that it tests. So a quote here, thus, this analysis is probably an underestimation of the full possible health benefits of Clean Cars Minnesota. Again, they're using the data they can prove and being conservative in the benefits. On page 75, this chart is over 10 years and looks like relatively low numbers, of people affected when you think of the overall population. And these numbers are relatively low unless they happen to you or your family or a loved one. Page 78, they go into the equity assessment, which they have to do as part of the rulemaking process and part of the state guidelines. And so here's an air quality risk chart, and this kind of shows where the bad pollution spots are in the state. And this is kind of why fleet averaging is important, because the outstate dealers might think they can't sell EVs, and they can look at this chart and say, well, are we really even going to get much pollution benefit out of it? And probably not way out in the country. And maybe most EVs and low emission vehicles will only sell in the city. But that's where most of the people are, and that's fine. They wouldn't have to carry these vehicles in those markets because the fleet can average over the whole state. So it's not a burden necessarily on those outstate dealers. And so they can implement this where the dealers or the manufacturers can be sending these vehicles to the dealers where they'll have the most impact and help benefit the air quality and equity all at the same time. So it seems like this is a good approach, to balance, sell them where you can sell them and where the need is greatest. Page 82 talks about the areas of concern for environmental justice, and these places would see the greatest reduction in those PM 2.5 particle pollution. That reduction in PM 2.5 would also benefit areas with hospitals, schools, nursing homes, and daycares, because they're frequently located near those high traffic areas. If you're going to put in a hospital, you want it to be right off the highway so people can get there soon. But that means those people who are trying to recover in hospitals have more exposure to the PM 2.5 pollution. Basically, they just conclude that this rule helps to improve environmental justice in those areas and will have the biggest impact on those who are most greatly affected. That may have been poor English there, sorry. So at this point, they've pretty much made their point, but go back through everything one more time, because what if the economy slows down due to COVID-19? So they do a sensitivity analysis to see how these different metrics, the charts and things we've kind of glossed over, and they're talking about how sales estimates roughly 5% slower than the original reference. So what would happen then? On page 88, they talk about the potential economic slowdown. Fewer sales overall would result in fewer low-emission vehicles and battery electric vehicles needed to meet the percentage of fleet numbers, because it is a percentage, not a specific number target that they need to hit. And so they say the economic downturn today reduces compliance requirements several years from now, because these are averaged over multiple years leading up to the model year you're paying your credits for. So here again, just my interjection is the rule would be a backstop, especially in a slowdown, to make sure that some of these vehicles are making it to Minnesota. On page 95, they talk about future economic slowdown is not likely to have a significant impact on the consumer benefits of a zero-emission standard in Minnesota. Part of this assumption in this proposed economic downturn is that, in this case, what if gasoline prices stay super low? And so they run all the numbers again with that factored in, and they say, we can conclude that even in a future with considerably lower gasoline prices, the zero-emission vehicle standard is likely to produce considerable benefits to Minnesota consumers. So you're still going to save money by using electricity rather than gasoline. And the health benefits would remain between the two scenarios. On page 96, they are talking about how they're establishing that initial zero-emission vehicle credit bank. They want to provide flexibility to manufacturers and give them a way to work ahead, getting early credits for sales in the prior years before the standards take place in model year 2025. Part of the way they would do that is with early action multipliers to give an added incentive. So a vehicle sold next year would have a 1.5 multiplier, or there would be multipliers applied. So you get a greater benefit for starting early, bringing these vehicles to Minnesota early. You can also add look-back years. So if the rule were to be enacted this year, 2021, you could include the 2020 and 2021 model years into your credits as well. And that just gives them extra running room. And they would put in a one-time allotment buffer to help them manage risk in case of an annual slump in sales. And we talked about that was actually a request from the manufacturers that they would like to do that so they can kind of have some predictability in their accounting. Then they looked at, again, a potential economic slowdown and found that that would not significantly interfere with amassing enough credits. So the manufacturers can do it. On pages 108 and 109, they go through charts basically showing with the different scenarios manufacturers could apply to their fleets, with the credit banks offering to help manufacturers on the front end. The earliest scenario, where they'd have to increase EV deliveries beyond business as usual, would be model year 2026, but could be as late as 27 or 28 or even 2029. So this gives manufacturers lots of flexibility and running room to make a plan and make sure they're hitting their targets by the end of the decade, or mid part of the decade to toward the end of the decade. And that takes us through the end of that document. Those are the big broad strokes that I thought were important to talk about. I know this got long, but hopefully it shows, there is some pretty deep thinking that has gone on in the last, since 2019 when they started these discussions about this rulemaking process. Another concern is for the dealers, and there's a few points I want to talk about on that front. One is, having these standards is going to make the dealers have to invest in training, maybe some additional equipment, charging stations on the dealer locations. A lot of the manufacturers are requiring that of their dealers anyway. And part of those improvements, if they're needed, in the SONAR document, they talk about how those kind of improvements could be financed through low interest loans through the state because they fall under a certain purview. But if the manufacturers are requiring them to do that anyway, it seems like whether or not we adopt these standards, that's going to happen. This would just be a way for them to help, get loans and financing that would better help them make that adjustment. Another argument is that people just don't want battery electric vehicles here or low emission vehicles here. Studies have shown that basically 30% of people last year were at least considering going electric or plug-in hybrid. But for a lot of people, not being able to take a test drive or see the vehicle beforehand makes it pretty daunting to buy a vehicle. I know there's the Tesla model and things, but generally people like to have a test drive, at least see the vehicle. Having them in Minnesota means more of them would sell. Having trained dealerships, with sales staff that can talk about the different features and what they need. With GM's new recent Bolt announcements, they were talking about how they would even help pay for the installation of a level 2 charging station in your home. So get your garage all set up with the purchase of this vehicle. So those are great incentives that dealers can talk about if they're educated and, have that ability to talk that way to a customer. And not to dog on a kind of vehicle that had a rough start. I've seen a few of them out on the road, but dealers had to sell the Pontiac Aztek. And I know some sold because I've seen them on the road. And so dealers aren't always given the best vehicles that they have to try to market and sell. And they still do. But it seems like most of the battery electric vehicles that are coming out now, the plug-in hybrids, are at least starting to look good and have decent range and statistics. So it can be something positive to sell rather than something you have to sell. As for stuff sitting on the dealer lots, there's still going to be plenty of internal combustion engine vehicles for people to buy. And the final thing I want to bring up is a race of technology that's going on in the world. And I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but the requirements of advancements in Europe and China are moving their technology level higher and higher. And the US luckily has one of the highest technology companies in Tesla. Arguably, Lucid could be in that conversation too. And those are American companies. There's a whole lot more that could go into that. And without getting into a whole national security conversation, I just feel it's important for us to be pushing the boundaries and setting broad targets. So I think it's a good way of saying we want the best and newest technology here, and we can help with the other clean car states to say that we want that here in the U.S. So thank you for sitting through all this. If you made it, I really appreciate it. Trust me, as long as this video was, it wasn't anything like reading this stuff firsthand. You're welcome to do it. I'll have links below where you can find these documents. Tomorrow is, as I said, the the final comment period, I believe, where this is going in front of the administrative rule judge to basically say yes or no. And so I'll be sending in a testimony. I can't do it live, but I will send my testimony in, why I feel this is important. If you disagree with me, feel free to let me know in the comments, but also, then testify on your behalf to the panel as well, because this is a democracy and voices should be heard. I feel like they've done a good job of incorporating criticisms and questions into their data and into their sonar document. You may have a perspective that hasn't been thought of yet. So if you feel the need to comment, either pro or con, please do that, because hearing multiple viewpoints is important. But again, thank you for watching. Sorry this got so long, but I appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one that will hopefully have some driving in it. So thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you later. Have a great day.